that there is a capital T truth out there, and we just need to find it and uncover it. And we need better methods and better tools and better theories. And eventually we will have the key to the universe. And that whole narrative, the going back to the Enlightenment, even calling it the Enlightenment, it is very, this idea of all of a sudden, like the light bulb came on, like we all of a sudden saw that there's this thing, science, and we were able to, escape from the drudgery and the, terribleness of the Dark Ages and, whatnot. And that's not to say that science hasn't had a lot of really positive benefits, but as people who, we are all in the process of being disciplined all the time by this Western apparatus of, knowledge production, circulation, and use. And I think that one of the things that we're kind of tricked into believing through this process is that there's only allowed to be one story. And, if you compare, thinking about spirituality and religion, like if you compare Judeo-Christian religions, which are really thoroughly intertwined, especially Christianity, with the Enlightenment, and you compare to, a lot of more Eastern traditions, which have a much less rigid sense that there have to be like really strict boundaries between like man and woman and humans and nature and the mind and the body. And, there's much more flexibility when you look at like indigenous knowledges or Eastern knowledges. There's a capacity, a recognition that you can hold multiple truths and multiple stories at the same time, and that, that it doesn't necessarily negate another story or another truth, right? And so that, I think, is how I would kind of answer your question, is I'm in my own research thinking about, trying to move away from very causal depictions of the way things are and hold complexity and be comfortable with complexity and uncertainty. And if there's anything that the last year has taught us, it is that is, more important than ever, I think.
This also comes in a big part of my research, right? My work so far has been in the American West, which is, arguably one of the most mythologized, perhaps, places in the world. And, add wolves and ranchers to that mix, right? You've got the sort of myth, the story of the big bad wolf, right? As devil figure almost. Teddy Roosevelt called them beasts of waste and desolation. You've got the cowboy myth of sort of settler colonialism, of whiteness, right? Something we've seen at the national level recently, and how that has played out in terms of ideas of power, of privilege, of entitlement, and reaction against maybe those of us who might challenge that myth. We got myths of wilderness, right? The idea that these are vast spaces that are with nature, with a capital N, without people, right? Erasing the long, deep history of indigenous presence in and modification of relationship to those landscapes, right? Working on questions of like human-wildlife conflict and coexistence, right? What kind of narrative work has to be done to challenge those deep stories, to give us an alternative way of thinking and understanding and then acting?
I have just about 2 questions left. The first one is, I think, the crux of this conversation for me, which is we've talked a lot about how we build worlds and what goes into built worlds and how they interact with our lived experiences. But for me, coming from a policy background, I guess the fundamental question is, how do we take all of that learned and applied knowledge and use it to improve the way that we communicate our politics and our policy?
I'm actually in the process of designing a course that I'm calling Sci-fi, Storytelling, and Science Communication, and specifically thinking about how can we use creative and critical world building to create new and innovative ways of communicating science to people, or, and it doesn't have to just be like science with a capital S. It could be, policy or, imagining these other ways, but essentially like, what are some ways that we can try to develop some of these communication pathways to people? And again, I just think of like the parable of the talents and the parable of the sowers by Octavia Butler, because you might not know anything about company towns and that history and that concept. But if you read her book, you would have an example and you'd be able to draw on that example, apply it, integrate it into other things that you are aware of. Similarly, Beasts of the Southern Wild, I think, is a perfect case study for thinking about the intersections of vulnerability and resilience and adaptation. So that is actually something I'm in the process of trying to work on, is this class that is explicitly thinking about it. I unfortunately don't have any actual examples yet of my own because I'm still in the early stages, but I'm on the same wavelength is what I'm saying.
Similarly, I don't know if I have good examples. I think part of our goal with the critical world building piece and thinking about this is starting a conversation or being a part of a conversation, bringing in some of the insights from critical geography and political ecology into thinking about this kind of question. I mean, for me, it's about, can we be reflexive in our thinking and sort of look at the assumptions of our frames, the sort of positioning that our stories make of particular groups of people. So if we're looking at, say, some of my research on wolf livestock conflict in the West, right? If your story is one that immediately sets up certain groups of people as the enemy or irredeemably a problem, right? You're going to have a hard time getting them on your side. And it's a fine line, though, between sort of working from where we are with all the problems thereof, the deep histories of dispossession, inequality, conflict, etc., but also trying to find an alternative sort of future. Going back to Paul Robbins' political ecology, just because I draw on this a lot in my thinking, but he has this concept of the hatchet and the seed within political ecology, this sort of frame approach to environmental questions. And the hatchet is, I always say, the sort of critical. You're going to cut down the problematic, maybe weeds, we'll say. But you also need that seed, that sort of normative potential for an alternative. And I think trying to think deeply about what sort of stories we're telling across media, across our analyses, but also in our fictions.
This last question is kind of a free for all. Is there anything that I haven't asked you that you think the audience should know?
One thing that I think is exciting for me, and this sort of connects to my pedagogy, right? As a teacher, when I do that, I have that hat on, but also as a game master. I've run Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder and other RPG games, more online these days, but is in thinking about storytelling and, I think by extension also world building as a collaborative project, a collective project. And this also connects to sort of maybe our ideal vision of science and scholarship, right? That this isn't, I think we need to be moving away from the vision of the sort of individual creator or thinker and thinking much more about these as collective projects. That in the classroom, we're learning, this isn't a model of the instructor sort of giving knowledge to students, but it is facilitating, creating an environment in which we can learn from each other and bring in insights from our own situated experiences and histories. In storytelling, it's this idea that they actually know Star Wars or Black Panther or, Dungeons and Dragons or whatever doesn't actually belong just to the company that officially owns it, but it is actually a relationship between a community of fans and people that are producing their own fan fiction or reinterpretations of this stuff, right? And like that's kind of what I think we've always been there, and increasingly we're sort of starting to recognize that this is the only way we move forward is thinking and working and creating together.
Coupling what Jeff just said with my earlier comments about this, course that I've been developing, and I have other courses where I'm trying to integrate critical world building. I really, I think down the line, and this is something Jeff and I have kind of touched on, and maybe one of these days you'll see an actual paper from us on it, but a pedagogy of critical world building, because at the most basic level, I think that pop culture and especially people who are interested in world building and speculative media, it can just be a really great doorway or gateway drug to get people interested in and thinking about topics and thinking more critically about them. But I think also, as Jeff mentioned, and as I think has been kind of an ongoing theme in this interview, is that we are all in the process always of continuously creating worlds. And, that can be in the sense of actually, crafting a world through a game or a piece of fiction, but it also, through our research and just the act of living in the world, right? Like we are all actors who are, creating this world together. And I similarly adhere to the pedagogical commitments that Jeff mentioned of, wanting to avoid that sage on the stage model of like, I am the genius, and I'm just going to like pour my knowledge into these like empty vases that are the students in front of me, and they'll regurgitate it onto a test, and then I'll have done my job. And I think a pedagogy of critical world building has the potential, if done well, to invite people into the process of world building as a simultaneous process of knowledge building, and like making that again a more collaborative process that hopefully will also help them just be more collaborative citizens who take this kind of flexibility in the face of uncertainty with them onward in their lives.
I mean, and just to pick up on that too, right? Like, I think this is also very relevant to thinking about politics and like political futures, right? That this is not, this kind of gets us away from a model as just waiting for the right creator or politician to kind of solve problems, but that we are all part of a political project and process of building our futures, building alternative worlds.
I mean, just thinking about your own work in public policy, just as Dr. Dylan Harris's piece in our special issue is looking at scientific reports as world building texts, I think that there is a really interesting way to think about policy documents and regulations as acts of world building, because like that is literally what they're doing, is they're trying to craft interventions to shape the world in certain ways. And so they are artifacts of that world building process. And so I think there could be like a really cool way to theorize that and think that through.
It's almost exactly where my mind went at the end of this conversation. Dr. Gretchen Sneegas, Dr. Jeff Martin, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having us.
It was a real pleasure. This has been so much fun.
And that's a wrap on another episode of UC3P. Credits go to me, Siddhant Wadera, for producing, interviewing, and editing this episode. Thank you again to Drs. Martin and Sneegas. If you're interested in their work, the link to their paper in Literary Geographies is in the show notes. Special thanks to Alon Sidel for helping me develop the questions for this interview. Our assistant production managers are Jack Emery and Ioana Lapuri. Our finance director is Ashwarya Kumar. Our communications director is Olu Ogidan, and our publisher is Yi-Ning Wang. Our intro music is Knockout 2 by Datubi, and our outro music is Yes Yes Y'all by Matt Large. Our cover art was designed by Shirin Raban. Please visit us on our website, uc3p.org. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. My name is Siddhant Wadera, and the main page will be back next week to discuss subnational authoritarianism.